That's Montana.
It's probably a pretty well-known fact that all of us as human beings started out pretty much the same, just like this lump of clay. But a lot of times we know the clay can turn into marvelous things. It just depends not only on the kind of clay it is, but also what the hands of the clay sculptor do to it. We hope you enjoyed today's program on That's Montana. Gary, we're sitting on the campus of Rocky Mountain College in Billings, and you've done a lot of design work in the past for them, and then that kind of evolved into your mountain project. Give us the road of where you've been and how it got here.
Well, it wasn't until I was going to talk to the college art class that I realized that the first mountains I pushed on anybody were right here at Rocky Mountain College when their president came to the ad agency I worked for and asked us for a new logo and some vehicle to recruit. And I said, well, you're named Rocky Mountain College. You need a mountain for your logo. So that was the start of it. And I didn't realize that until I was supposed to talk to this class and realized that was the first mountain I pushed.
Well, we've got video that we're going to show too of you talking to some of the students up here and showing and sharing your passion.
I use oil-based clay, but you could use almost any kind. You could use just regular clay, the clay that I made that out of. You could use, this clay. You can mold from any kind of clay. And then the only tricky part about how to make that mold, to pour the plaster around it, is that this clay has to be, firm enough to where it's not going to turn to mush when the wet plaster hits it. So, but I use oil-based clay, the gray clay like they use in grade school. I use that stuff because I can buy it by the, wad. and it's cheap, and I use it over again, and it's oil-based, so it comes out of the mold really easily too. And it washes up with soap and water. So once I get it out of the mold, I can take an old brush and some hot water with a little soap in it and, get it all out of there. So I set this piece down. If I want to make a mold of this, I set this piece down and I make sure it can't float around. So it has to be on a board. I build a fence around it out of wood as thick as I want my mold. Mm-hmm. I mix plaster and I dump it on there. There you go. You got a mold. And then you take that piece of plaster and you set it somewhere because it's green and you couldn't suck any moisture out of anything with that. It's very green. Then I let them age for a month, at least a month. So, and there's a little bit to that. And then the very first impression that you get out of the mold is going to take, it's a little, you really got to nurse it out of there. None of my pieces have any of the final texture in them in the mold, okay? What I've done that's a sculpture it's as close as I can get it without having any fine detail in it, because all of that fine detail is going to hang up in that mold and it's going to make that piece of clay want to stay there. So you kind of want to have some, but actually, and another thing to say is that the really big smooth areas, like if it was prairie or something, a big smooth area, they hang up too. So you kind of want a little bit of texture, a little bit of relief, but not too much. And then that comes out of there, then that's where I start. So they come out of the same mold, but I paint them different, and I put different textures in, and I'm thinking about different things at the time. Sometimes I'm, putting more detail down here in the trees down below, and sometimes I'm leaving the trees completely off, all the texture off of the distant mountains. So, those are all decisions that I make just to keep it interesting,
Now, you said you fell in love with mountains in kind of a unique way of traveling around with your family.
Yeah, my folks were from Clyde Park, which is up in elevation and between the Crazy Mountains and the Bridger Mountains in the Shields River Valley. And so I grew up surrounded by mountains. And whenever we would go anywhere, my brother got car sick. And so my mom would say, well, look at the mountains, because if you looked out in the distance, that wasn't moving and you wouldn't get car sick. Well, I was looking a lot closer than my brothers were.
How did you choose clay over paint for the project that you have?
Well, I started out that I love mountains and I paint mountains. So I've done a lot of landscapes of mountains and making sure that I get them just right. And one day I was painting a painting and I was using my palette knife and painting a ridge and struggling with it as any good artist would do. And I had the thought, I could almost sculpt this easier than I could paint it. And I stood back from my canvas and went, yeah, I could sculpt that. And that was where the idea started.
That's Montana. We'll be right back.
Gary, we go from the plains to the mountains. 56 mountain ranges supposedly across the state of Montana. How do you make a choice of what you want to do and what it means to you?
Well, I plan on doing them all. But the ones that have white on them are over 9,000 feet. That's my first priority. Those that have highways by them, because I want people to learn the mountains by the highways first. So those are my first priority.
You must plan on living a couple hundred years in order to be able to do that. How long have you been working on this?
Well, since 2006. And in that period of time, I have 31 pieces and probably 25, so a little less than half. But I come from a family that lives to be 90-something, so. The only thing that I would say about the mountains is that, you know, the people in the East always get left out when you start talking about mountains. And for some reason or other, they are very touchy about that. But the reality is that the mountains provide the water for all these rivers. You know, somebody from Glasgow acted like, you know, well, what do we have to do with the mountains, you know? And that all the people from Missoula come over here to fill their tag. And I said, yeah, but what about the rivers? You know, that water comes from the mountains. So the mountains provide the water for the state. That, except for that flows to the Columbia. So, you know, the mountains are the wellspring for all of this. You know?
Gary, this beautiful piece, you call it Lake McDonald out of Glacier National Park, if somebody had this in their home, they would actually be able to show people all of the high points north of Lake McDonald in the foreground. Give us a tour, if you will, of what the mountain peaks are as we take a look at this.
Okay, well, above Lake McDonald is Mount Stanton, which is this one. This is Mount Vaught. This is Mount McPartland, the Garden Wall, Mount Cannon, Mount Brown, Mount Reynolds back in there, the Little Matterhorn, Mount Edwards, and Gunsight Mountain.
All wrapped around Lake McDonald and Glacier National Park. What's next?
I got lots of mountains left to do. Mountains, I have just barely touched the surface. There are still a lot of mountains that carry the Continental Divide that I want to do that are of interest to me. And a lot of mountains that are still over 10,000 feet that I want to get. And then I'll work my way down. But the sculpture is only one part of what I want to do to help teach the people in Montana the mountains. And so my project is called Montana Uplift, and that involves doing illustrations of a weekly newspaper segment for the Montana Newspaper Association, and also doing a glove box guide to the mountains of Montana that I hoped would be in everyone's glove box, so that as they're driving around from the road that they would be able to refer to my little guide and get an idea of what mountains they're looking at when they're traveling a certain highway. So,
Gary, we've talked about the fact that the mountains have been here forever and will be after we're gone. What kind of legacy would you like to leave if you could?
Well, one of my favorite thoughts is that sometime way in the future that someone would unearth one of my sculptures and dust it off, put it back together if it was in pieces, and hold it up and say, hey, aren't these those mountains?
Gary Little, another Montanan giving back. That's Montana. We'll be right back.